Trust is a fragile thing. You don't realize it's broken until the knife's already in your back. My name is Aaron Matthews. I'm 52 years old. Spent half my life as a cop, the other half trying to forget it. I walked away from the badge when I realized it wasn't about justice anymore, just politics and favors. Now I work on my own terms, handling private security for people who don't trust the system either. Keeps the lights on. Keeps me busy. Chicago is a city that's been rotting for years. The streets stink of broken promises, and most men are too scared or too comfortable to do anything about it. Me? I've never been good at looking the other way. That's why I take care of my own, the ones who actually deserve it. The kids running the alleys, the shop owners who get shaken down, the people who don't have someone watching their back. Used to be I could do something about it with a badge. Now I do it with my own two hands. I used to think I had a home, too. A wife. Grace. 15 years. That's how long I played house, thinking it meant something. Thought we had an understanding. She handled the soft stuff, I handled the world outside. Turns out, she was handling more than I knew. The first sign was the phone. Women think they're subtle about it, but they aren't. The screen always face down. Smiles that don't fit the conversation. Work suddenly got a hell of a lot busier, except there was never any overtime on the pay stub. I'm not the jealous type, but I am a careful one. Years on the job taught me one thing. When your gut says something's off, it is. So I started watching. Not like a husband. Like a cop. Bank statements told me what I already knew. Charges at high-end restaurants. Hotel stays under different names. Money siphoned from our accounts in just small enough amounts to avoid raising questions. Stupid. If you're gonna betray someone, at least be smart about it. Grace wasn't. One night, I got home late. Work had me trailing some low-level thug trying to skip out on a debt. When I stepped inside, the house smelled like her perfume, but she wasn't in bed. I stood in the hallway for a second, listening. The shower was running. That's when I saw it. Her purse, dumped on the kitchen counter, half open. And inside, tucked between her wallet and keys, a receipt. The kind you don't keep unless you're trying to remember something. Dinner for two at a restaurant she's never mentioned. The date? Last night. The card used? Ours. I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers. A neat little signature at the bottom. Not mine. I set it back down, careful, controlled. Then I grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap, and waited. Not in the living room, not in the bedroom. At the kitchen table, facing the door. It took her 15 minutes to come downstairs, hair still damp, wrapped in one of those silk robes she only wore when she wanted something. "Hey," she said, voice soft, almost hesitant. "You're home late." I took a slow sip of my beer, set the bottle down, and slid the receipt across the table. She looked at it. Her face didn't change. That told me everything. "That's not mine," she said. I leaned back, crossed my arms. "Try again." A flicker of something behind her eyes. Not guilt. Annoyance. Like I was inconveniencing her. She let out a slow breath, then sat down across from me, hands folded on the table like we were negotiating a contract. "Aaron." I held up a hand. "Save it." She closed her mouth. "Good." I tapped the receipt. "You paid for a steakhouse I've never been to with a man who isn't me. And you were sloppy about it. That tells me one of two things. Either you don't care if I find out, or you don't think I'll do anything about it." Silence. I finished my beer, stood up. "I'll be out tomorrow morning. By the time I come back, I expect you to have something better than it's not mine." She swallowed, looking up at me. "Aaron, please." I walked out before she could finish. I didn't need to hear whatever excuse she had lined up. I already knew the truth. The only thing left was deciding what I was going to do about it. And I wasn't the kind of man to do nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even try. I spent it in my truck, parked a few blocks from the house, engine off, watching the sky shift from black to gray. By morning, I had a plan. I went back inside, took a shower, got dressed. Grace wasn't in the bedroom. No surprise. She was in the kitchen, sitting at the same table where I'd left her the night before, 2 cups of coffee in front of her. A peace offering. I ignored it. She watched as I grabbed my jacket and keys. "Aaron, we need to talk." I slid my wallet into my pocket. "No, we don't." She let out a sharp breath, rubbed her temples. "You're being impossible." I turned to look at her. She wasn't panicked. Wasn't crying. Just frustrated, like she was dealing with a stubborn coworker. I studied her for a long second. The woman I'd married had been kind, thoughtful. This woman? She'd already made her peace with whatever she was doing. I nodded, mostly to myself. I'll be home late. Then I left. I had work to do. Leah's diner opened at 6. I was there at 5:50, leaning against the hood of my truck, waiting for her to unlock the doors. When she saw me, she sighed. Jesus, Aaron. What now? I followed her inside, helped her flip the chairs down. Need a favor. She set a tray of silverware on the counter. It involved breaking kneecaps? I shook my head. Not this time. She poured herself a coffee, didn't offer me one. All right, let's hear it. I pulled out my phone, slid it across the counter. The bank statements were already open. Leah scrolled through them, frowning. Then she looked up at me, eyes sharp. Grace. I nodded. She muttered a curse under her breath, set the phone down. You sure? I took out the receipt from last night, unfolded it, laid it next to the phone. Leah didn't pick it up. She just stared at it, jaw tight. Who's the guy? Roman Larson. 42. Calls himself a consultant, but he's just another con man. She shook her head, snatched up the coffee pot, and started pouring aggressively. Unbelievable. I never liked her. I raised an eyebrow. You never like anyone. That's because most people are idiots. She pointed the coffee pot at me. You're handling this, right? Already started. Good. She put the pot down, crossed her arms. What do you need from me? Keep your ears open. She'll probably start spinning a story soon. I want to know what it is. Leah gave me a hard look. You sure you don't just want to throw her out? I smirked. Where's the fun in that? She grunted. Just don't be stupid, Aaron. I never am. Leah snorted. Right? That's why you married her in the first place. I didn't argue. By noon, I had everything I needed. Roman Larson was exactly what I expected. A smooth-talking grifter who hopped from one rich woman to the next, draining their accounts before disappearing. He had a record, but nothing that stuck. Fraud, tax evasion, identity theft, always slipping through the cracks. Smart enough to cover his tracks, but not smart enough to stay off my radar. I made a few calls, pulled a few favors. It wasn't hard to get someone to look into his finances. By 4, I had a full picture. Grace wasn't just cheating, she was paying him, bankrolling whatever scam he was running. That pissed me off more than anything. I went home after dark. Grace was on the couch, a half-empty glass of wine on the table, staring at her phone. When she saw me, she straightened. Aaron. I ignored her, went to the fridge, grabbed a beer. She hesitated, then set the phone down. I cut her off. Don't. She flinched like I'd slapped her. I just want to explain. I twisted the cap off, took a slow sip. Go ahead. She blinked, thrown off by the invitation. Probably expected me to walk out again. She swallowed, straightened her shoulders. I didn't mean for it to happen, she started. I was lonely. I offered. She hesitated. I needed something. Something more. I nodded, setting the beer down. And you found it in him. She pressed her lips together. I didn't plan this, Aaron. I let that hang between us. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the counter. Do you love him? She looked away. That was answer enough. I exhaled slowly, shook my head. You know what pisses me off the most? It's not even that you cheated. It's that you thought I wouldn't notice. Grace's jaw tightened. So what now? I stood up, grabbed my beer, and started walking toward the bedroom. Now. I glanced back at her. Now I let you figure out just how much you've lost. I shut the door behind me. She didn't follow. I gave her a week. Not because I was hesitating, not because I was unsure, just to see what she'd do when she thought I wasn't watching. Some people, when they get caught, they panic, scramble, try to fix things. Others double down, start covering their tracks, shifting blame. Grace? She did neither. She waited, like she thought I'd cool off, come around, pretend nothing had happened. She didn't know me at all. I spent the time putting things in motion. People owed me favors, and I cashed them in. I had Roman Larson's business accounts flagged, his tax history combed through, his past dug up. Turns out, he had plenty of skeletons, just needed the right push for them to come rattling out. By Friday, I was sitting in my truck outside a downtown office building, watching him through binoculars. He stepped out of a black sedan, adjusted his tie, flashed a grin at the woman next to him. Some poor idiot who probably thought she was special. He had the look of a man who'd never had to answer for anything in his life. That was about to change. I made a call. It's him. The voice on the other end, an old friend from my days on the force, let out a low chuckle. Consider it handled. I hung up. Roman Larson's world was about to get a whole lot smaller. By the time I got home, Grace was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, glass of white wine next to her. I shut the door behind me, watched as she tapped out a message, then locked the screen. Her eyes flicked up to mine. Where have you been? I set my keys on the counter. Working. She hesitated. Aaron. I raised a brow. She took a breath, straightened. We need to talk about this. No. I said, opening the fridge, pulling out a beer. We don't. Her fingers curled around her phone. You can't just pretend this isn't happening. I twisted the cap off, took a sip. I'm not pretending. I'm just done listening to your bullshit. She exhaled, set the phone down. You think you're punishing me? The silent treatment? Making me sit here and wonder what you're thinking. I chuckled, shaking my head. Grace, I don't give a damn what you think. You made your choices. You get to live with them. Something flickered in her expression. She thought I'd still be fighting for this, for her. Thought I'd rage, threaten, beg. She didn't understand that the second I knew, she was already dead to me. She reached for her wine, took a slow sip. Are you going to divorce me? Eventually. Her lips pressed together. You don't have to be like this. I met her gaze. Like what? Cold. Cruel. I let out a quiet laugh. You have no idea what cruel looks like. She stared at me for a long second, then shook her head. You think you're the only one who's been hurt in this marriage? You think you're the only one who's sacrificed? I took another drink, watching her. Her voice sharpened. You were never home. You were always working, always out there playing hero while I was stuck here, wondering if you even cared anymore. I smirked. So that's what this is? Some sad little revenge story. You wanted attention, so you spread your legs for the first man who told you you were special? Her face flushed. Screw you, Aaron. I set my beer down, stepped closer, voice low, steady. No. Screw you, Grace. You didn't just cheat. You stole from me. You lied to my face. And the worst part? You thought I wouldn't find out. You thought I was stupid. She swallowed, but held her ground. So what now? You going to make my life hell? I tilted my head. Not my job. You're doing a fine job of that yourself. She glared at me. You're enjoying this. I shrugged. Not really. I just like watching people get what they deserve. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, hesitated. I picked up my beer, took a slow sip. Go ahead. Answer it. She didn't move. I smiled. That's what I thought. I grabbed my keys and walked out. The next morning, I was at the diner. Leah had already heard. She poured me coffee without asking, then leaned on the counter, arms crossed. So what's next? I sipped the coffee, just watching the dominoes fall. She smirked. You always were patient. Only when it's worth it. She tapped a spoon against the counter, thinking, you want me to talk to a lawyer? Not yet. I glanced at the clock. Give it another day or two. She frowned. For what? I smiled, slow and steady. For the real fun to start. Roman Larson's world started crumbling by Monday morning. I was sitting in my truck across the street from his office, drinking coffee, when I saw him step out of his car, dressed like a man who thought he had the world in his pocket. His stride was confident, his phone to his ear, probably making promises he couldn't keep. Then he stopped. Two men in dark suits were waiting for him on the sidewalk. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The way his shoulders stiffened, the way his free hand twitched at his side, it was all I needed to know. These weren't just men in suits. They were IRS agents. He tried to play it cool, nodding, gesturing, but they weren't buying it. One of them showed him a folder. His face drained of color. Beautiful. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched as they walked him inside. That was step one. Step two happened a few hours later, when Grace got a phone call at work. Leah texted me the moment it happened. She's rattled. Looking sick. You want me to push? I texted back. No. Let her sweat. By the time I got home that night, the house felt different. Grace was in the kitchen, pacing, glass of wine in one hand, phone in the other. She didn't look up when I walked in. Didn't say a word. I dropped my keys on the counter, pulled a beer from the fridge, popped the cap, and leaned against the counter, watching her. Finally, she stopped pacing, swallowed, then turned to face me. They're investigating Roman. I took a sip. Yeah, I heard. Her eyes narrowed. You did this. I didn't say anything. Just took another sip. She stepped closer. Damn it, Aaron, you don't get to ruin people's lives just because you're mad at me. I let out a short laugh. Ruin? Grace, the man's a crook. You don't accidentally commit tax fraud. He knew exactly what he was doing. She clenched her jaw. They're freezing his accounts. I raised an eyebrow. His accounts? Or yours? Her fingers tightened around the wine glass. I didn't do anything wrong. I tilted my head, studying her. That's so. I took my phone out, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward her. A bank transfer, $3,000, from our joint account to his personal one. A different amount, every month, for the last year. Looks like you did plenty. She paled. Where did you get that? I shrugged. Friends in the right places. She stared at the screen, then looked up at me. Aaron, you have to help me. I smiled. No, I really don't. She set the wine glass down, bracing her hands on the counter. They're going to pull me into this. I leaned forward. Then you'd better start thinking about how you're going to explain that to them. Her breath hitched. Save it, I said, pushing off the counter. You made your bed. I grabbed my beer and started toward the living room. Now lie in it. She didn't follow. The next morning, I walked into Leah's diner, took my usual seat at the counter, and waited. It didn't take long. She slid a plate in front of me, hands on her hips. Grace called me last night. I picked up my fork. Bet that was fun. She's panicking. She should be. Leah shook her head. Aaron, what's your endgame here? I took a bite of eggs, chewed, swallowed. Justice. She snorted. Bullshit. This is personal. I set my fork down, met her gaze. Damn right it is. She studied me for a long second, then sighed. You're gonna bury her, aren't you? I took a sip of coffee, then nodded. Deep. Leah exhaled through her nose, then shook her head. Good. She deserves it. I smirked, picked up my fork, and went back to eating. Grace moved out 3 days later. She packed in silence, stuffing clothes into suitcases, avoiding eye contact. I didn't offer to help. Just sat in the living room with a beer, watching the news, listening to the dull sounds of zippers and drawers sliding shut. There wasn't much to say. When she finally came down the stairs, she hesitated near the door. This is really it, then? I didn't bother looking up. Guess so. She exhaled, shifting her grip on the suitcase handle. I never wanted it to end like this. I took a slow sip, then set the bottle down. Then you shouldn't have lied. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. Grace. I finally met her eyes, my voice flat. Don't. She nodded once, lips pressed together, then turned and walked out. The door shut behind her with a soft, final click. I sat there a while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of traffic outside. Then I stood, grabbed my keys, and left. I had more important things to do. Jade Kelly was waiting for me at a bar on the south side, same dive we used to hit after late shifts. He had 2 whiskeys already poured, one in front of the empty seat across from him. He eyed me as I slid into the chair, then smirked. Heard your wife finally took off. I picked up the glass, took a sip. She was overdue. Jaden chuckled, shaking his head. So what's next, Aaron? You finally gonna let this grudge go? I raised an eyebrow. You think this was about a grudge? He shrugged, leaning back in his seat. I think you've been playing executioner long enough. She's out of your life. Larson's looking at federal charges. You got what you wanted. I studied him for a moment, then set my glass down. What I wanted was for people to pay for what they did. And they have, he said, spreading his hands. So why do you still look like a man with unfinished business? I didn't answer right away. Just let the question hang there. Jaden sighed, rubbing his jaw. Look, Aaron, I know you don't trust the system anymore. Hell, half the time, I don't either. But you can't fix everything with your own 2 hands. I smirked. I can try. He shook his head. You ever think about coming back? Not as a cop, something else. Private security, investigation. Hell, even teaching. You're good at this. You just need to aim it at something that won't land you in a cell. I finished my whiskey, set the glass down with a dull thunk. I'll think about it. Jaden rolled his eyes. No, you won't. I smirked. No, I won't. He sighed again, then lifted his glass. Well, whatever you do, just don't get yourself killed. I clinked my glass against his. No promises. By the next morning, I was standing in an empty house. The silence was different now. Before, it had been heavy, filled with unspoken words and tension thick enough to choke on. Now it was just quiet. I liked it. I made a pot of coffee, took my mug out to the back porch, and watched the sun climb over the rooftops. The city never stopped moving, never gave a damn about your problems. There was something comforting about that. My phone buzzed. A text from Leah. Grace is trying to spin the story. Says you scared her. That you pushed her out. I snorted. Let her. Anyone who knows me won't buy it. A pause. Then another message. You doing okay? I stared at the screen for a second, then typed back. Yeah, I am. And for the first time in a long while, it was the truth. The first thing I did was change the locks. Not because I thought Grace would come back, she had too much pride for that, but because it felt right, like sealing off the last open door to something that no longer mattered. By noon, I had a locksmith over, a guy in his 60s with rough hands and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He worked fast, didn't ask questions, just did the job. When he finished, he tested the new deadbolt and wiped his hands on his jeans. Move out. I nodded. Something like that. He grunted, packed up his tools. Good. You look like a man who deserves some peace. I tipped him extra, then stood at the doorway, testing the weight of the new keys in my palm. Felt different. Heavier. Good. The next few weeks passed like nothing had happened. The city kept moving, crime didn't stop, and people went about their business. Grace tried to save face, but it didn't work. Turns out, people don't take too kindly to a woman using joint accounts to fund her affair with a two-bit con man. Word spread, and before long, she was a walking cautionary tale. Leah heard the best version. She told Sharon at the salon that you drove her away with your anger. I chuckled, sipping my coffee. That right? Oh yeah, Leah said, leaning against the counter. Said you made her feel trapped and unloved. I shook my head. The only thing I ever trapped her in was a marriage she swore she wanted. Leah smirked. Don't worry. Sharon set the record straight. I raised an eyebrow. What did she say? That Grace didn't look too trapped when she was sitting on Roman Larson's lap at some bar 6 months ago. I let out a low laugh. Guess I owe Sharon a drink. Leah grinned. She prefers whiskey. Duly noted. I didn't hear from Grace again, not directly. The closest thing was a text from a number I didn't recognize, a single line that told me all I needed to know. I hope you're happy. I deleted it without answering. I was. The security firm took off quicker than I expected. Jaden was right. I was good at this. I built a team, men I trusted, guys who knew how to handle themselves and didn't need babysitting. We weren't just bodyguards for rich idiots, we handled problems. If someone needed their assets protected, their business secured, their enemies warned, we handled it. It wasn't about the money, though the money was damn good. It was about control, doing things my way, keeping the right people safe, and making sure the wrong ones knew better than to step out of line. Leah called it playing judge, jury, and executioner. I called it fixing what the cops wouldn't. Same thing, different name. One afternoon, I was locking up the office when I heard a familiar voice from across the street. You're really leaning into the whole private enforcer thing, huh? Jaden. Leaning against his car, arms crossed, smirking. I adjusted my jacket, walked over. You got a problem with that? He shrugged. Depends. You keeping it legal? I met his eyes. Legal enough. Jaden exhaled, shaking his head. Jesus, Aaron, you ever gonna slow down? Not in my nature. He chuckled, pushing off the car. That's what I thought. He pulled out a pack of gum, offered me a piece. I took it. As I unwrapped it, he looked at me, more serious now. For what it's worth, I think you landed on your feet. I smirked, popped the gum in my mouth. I always do. Jaden nodded once, then slid into his car. Just don't get yourself killed, all right? No promises. He pulled away, taillights disappearing into traffic. I stood there a moment, hands in my pockets, watching the city move. Then I turned, locked up, and headed home. Grace was gone. Roman Larson was facing prison time. And me? I was just getting started. 3 months later, I barely thought about her. Not because I forced myself to forget, but because she wasn't worth remembering. Grace had taken what she wanted and lost everything in the process. Last I heard, she was bouncing between friends' couches, trying to pull together a new life. No one trusted her. No one wanted to. People don't forget betrayal, especially when money's involved. Roman Larson wasn't doing much better. The IRS had their teeth in him, and the feds weren't far behind. His accounts were frozen, his scams laid bare, and his luck had finally run out. A man like that didn't survive without money. He was a parasite, and now, with no host left to leech off, he was circling the drain. I wasn't losing sleep over it. Business was thriving. The security firm had contracts locked in with high-end clients, businesses that needed protection from the kind of scum I used to put behind bars. The work was clean, the money good, and the sense of control? That was the real prize. I decided who got protection and who got left to fend for themselves. I had no interest in saving people who didn't deserve it. Leah made me dinner one night, some kind of stew she'd been perfecting for years. She set a bowl in front of me, sat across the table, arms crossed. So, what's next? I took a bite, chewed, swallowed. What do you mean? She gave me a look. Aaron, you don't sit still. You don't retire. You don't move on like a normal person. So what's next? I smirked. More of the same. She sighed. You're exhausting. I shrugged, taking another bite. I like what I do. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. Just don't forget to actually live while you're at it. I didn't answer. A week later, I was sitting on my porch, watching the streetlights flicker on, when my phone buzzed. A name I didn't expect. Jaden. I answered. Didn't think I'd hear from you. He chuckled on the other end. Yeah, well, you got time for a drink? I glanced at the quiet street, the city humming in the distance. Always. An hour later, we were at our usual bar, whiskey in hand. Jaden leaned back in his chair, studying me. You look different. Different how? He smirked. Less angry. More dangerous. I chuckled, took a slow sip. Comes with the territory. Jaden nodded, then leaned forward. I got a job for you. I raised an eyebrow. Not police work, he clarified. Private. Off the record. I didn't blink. Go on. He slid a folder across the table. Some people still need fixing, Aaron. I opened it, scanned the pages. Names, faces, a case that smelled like rot. I smiled, slow and steady. Jaden watched me. So? I closed the folder, tapped a finger on the cover. Let's get to work. And just like that, I was back in the game. But this time, I was the one making the rules.